Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to our 4:30 p.m. chat. My name is Stephanie from Annick Press, and today we are so excited to have Aimée Craft with us, the author of Treaty Words for As Long as the River Flows, which is published today by Annick Press. Aimée is an Anishinaabe Métis lawyer from Treaty 1 territory in Manitoba, Canada. She is an associate professor at the Faculty of Common Law at the University of Ottawa and a leading researcher on Indigenous laws, treaties, and water. And Aimée, thank you so much for joining us today. We're so excited to have you.
It's my pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. This is just a beautiful book, and your writing is so evocative, and Luke's photos and illustrations rather really lend a lot to your words. So I'm hoping today you can share some of your writing with us, and then after we do a bit of reading, we'll open it up to the chat if there's any questions from our group here.
Sure. Thanks, Stephanie. I just want to start by saying how much I wish we could be sitting in person. And for those of you who have picked up the book, I really wish we could be sitting by a fire together. It's a really nice day where I'm talking, well, nice. That's all relative. It's gray, but it's warm where I'm speaking to you from, and it's my home territory. So I'm in Treaty 1 territory in Manitoba. I'm not sitting by a river by a fire because the Wi-Fi would be probably a significant issue. Which is our current day modern problem that many of us are experiencing. But I did want to say that I hope that each of you will have an opportunity to sit and read this in a space where you can take some time to reflect and be in connection with your natural environment. And hopefully that includes being in connection with some of the people that you love, including some of the young people in your life. And I just also wanted to preface this by saying, the book is, it has a target audience of young people, but it's really a book for everyone. And it's, in my view, meant to be read together. So I think it's a perfect bedtime storybook. It's a perfect morning coffee, hanging out in pajamas Saturday morning book. And I think that it's one that will spur some conversations around the kitchen table and around sitting around either by a fire or, in those spaces that each of us finds comfortable. So if you can kind of maybe close your eyes, I can't see you, but transport yourself into that cozy space. And I'll read a brief excerpt from sort of the center of the book and then a piece from a little bit further on in the book. So on these and other visits, they sat looking across and at the river, sometimes talking to each other, but more often sitting in silence, listening. The beauty of their silence was in everything that they heard around them. Mishomis, who's the grandfather, taught her how to hear, challenging her to understand each sound, from the most pronounced bird calls to the subtle sound of tiny insects crawling around in the grass. One particular spring, which followed a winter with more snow and cold weather than in previous years, she went to visit him. He'd come back from his spring trip, but much of the land still rested under thin, interspersed pockets of snow. They sat on the tall bank of the river, facing east, looking towards the other distant bank. He recounted tales of snaring rabbits, finding old camps, building fires, drinking tea, hearing a baby moose being born, and eating fresh fish from the small spring-fed lakes. Then they sat and let the silence speak. They were surrounded by tall grass swaying in the wind, the midday sun warming their faces. The trees were making their spring sounds, popping and cracking, the snow blowing by and whooshing against her skin, and spring birds making their small and distinctive calls. The geese honked as they flew over, telling her and Mishomis that they had seen them. The geese wanted them to know that they'd made it home. They heard all of these sounds above that of the ice breaking, at once subtle, deafening, calming, and distracting. Every sound was outside and inside of them. They knew that all this would be happening with or without them, and that they were such a small part of creation. Although the sun was warm, Mishomis set out to build a small fire. That was usually a sign that someone would be by to visit, or that they might be sitting out for another long while. The fire was to keep them warm and make tea, but mostly it was a place to hold their gaze as they told stories, jokes, or as they sat in silence. So this is a bit later in their day. Mishomis paused to throw some tea bags in the boiling water. And this is what he said. The first treaty that was made between the earth and the sky, it was an agreement to work together. We build all our treaties on that original treaty. And that's what we said to the crown when they came to discuss how we would like to live together on this land. For as long as the sun shines, the grass grows and the rivers flow, like the original treaty. The young girl and her Mishomis then sat in silence. She listened to the flow of the river and the wind moving around in the grass, and she felt her face warm with the glow of the fire and the spring sun. So that's what I wanted to share with you today in terms of an excerpt from the book. Actually, I feel a little bit emotional reading parts of it because I feel transposed back to a time when I got to do this, and I actually missed those opportunities to sit on the riverbank and just listen in silence. So thank you for the opportunity to share this with you.
Thank you very much for sharing with us today, Aimée. And it's true, it brings me back to my childhood as well. And my kokum always told us such beautiful stories. My kokum is my grandmother, and it was so important to learn from her and to carry those stories with us. And it's an honor to hear a story from somebody else. So thank you very much. We'd like to open to any questions from the chat. I have a few questions of my own that I'd like to ask. So if nobody has anything burning right now, I can pop up a couple of questions myself. Or if you'd like to be unmuted, please let us know and we can unmute you and you can ask Aimée directly.
I wonder if people are familiar with the raise hand function, which is in the reactions. It used to be in a different place in Zoom and now it's in reactions. So you can send me smiley faces. You can put smiley faces up on your profile, but you can also use a function in there that's called raised hand. And then we can unmute. You can ask your question. I now teach fully online. So these are tools that I use every day.
You're the most adept with online platforms. I've got a question myself, actually. We talked about how important it is for stories and histories. Oh, I'm sorry, we've got a question in the chat from Adobe. Treaty Words is beautifully written. What would you like younger readers to take away from the story?
Thank you. I would love for young readers to take away a few things. The first is really about how the central character is them also, that they are big and they're small and they're connected to everything and that they have treaty obligations. And so, you know, in order to see themselves and be in that space, I think each person needs to kind of connect with that story and to take from that their treaty obligations. So in terms of a substantive takeaway, I think that if young people are reading this and understanding that treaties are agreements to share in land and to live well together, then the book will have done its work. And yeah, I'm primarily an academic. I didn't ever think in my life that I would write a children's book. And I'm really grateful to Mary Beth, who suggested that the story become a children's book, because the main purpose in writing this was to make treaties have real life sense to people. They're not words on pages. They're agreements to work together, to live together. They're about relationships. And so if you can understand that, everything before us was relational, in relationship, that all of our natural environment is in relationship, then we can see how we need to try and do better in terms of understanding those treaty relationships that were built by our ancestors, and give them some effect today. And so my adult version of something like this book that talks about Anishinaabe understandings of treaty is called Breathing Life into the Stone Fort Treaty. And I love that title. It came in a ceremony, and I think that's the most important thing that we need to do collectively, is to breathe life into our treaty relationships. And this book is one small contribution towards that.
Thank you, Aimée. You hit it perfectly on the head. So thank you so much and thank you, Adobe, for your question. Are there any more questions that anyone wants to pop into the chat? Or if you'd like us to unmute you, you can absolutely ask your question directly. Great, thank you. Your writing is so beautiful and evocative, like I've already mentioned, and Luke's imagery just further brings it to life. And I think the idea of reading this story out in nature, by the fire, by the river, is so inspiring. When you were writing this book, did you have that in mind? Did you find that the writing process energized you in any way?
I have a very odd writing process. And for those of you who are artists of any form, you'll know that everybody has a different way of doing things. So I like to tell the story many, many times. My nieces and nephews, they'll hear the same story over and over again. So I like to tell the story. And I think that that's part of my upbringing and my tradition is to storytell. And my writing, as you've seen, is trying to communicate in a very accessible and authentic way what it is that we would say. And you can hear it in, the Mishomis's words, that those are really how he would speak and how he would share the story of treaty. And I think that part is important. And then trying to then get an oral story onto paper kind of becomes this funny process. I don't know if I've really mastered it, and I really appreciate those who worked on editing the story to make it clear. But to me, the way this is written is the way that it sounds in my head and the way that it came out. And I think that that's really important, because words have a spirit and stories have a spirit. And that's part of why I hope that people read the book out loud, because it really is meant to be one of those types of stories where you share it with other people. And what you then are able to bring to it collectively is just as important as the words on paper.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So we've got a few questions in the chat here now. How much of the story is pulled from your personal experience?
A lot of it, and that was part of the question about, whether this is actually fiction. The story of treaty is real, and so in that, that's that I think is an important part of the history of Canada and of our different treaty territories. It's also part of our modern lived experience, and something that I think we need to, as I said earlier, do better on living that relationship. But a lot of it is based on conversations that I've had over time and experiences that I've had laying by the river and listening to the ice break up and seeing that collaboration between the sun and the water, and being able to lend an interpretive lens to that and saying, wow, this is what the concept of renewal actually is modeled on, was an eye-opening experience for me. Because I think as young people, you're either searching for information or pushing information away. And this is a description of a moment in time where I had taken enough in that I was able to come up with my own interpretation of what was happening and apply the knowledge that had been shared with me in a way that allowed me to kind of dive deeper into my own understanding. And and I love those moments, right, of remembering things that you've been taught or told and applying it in your own way. And if young people are able to see that in this character, that she's not just a listener, she's a thinker and she's a doer and she's having her own ideas, and then she wants to act. I think those are all really important, empowering takeaway messages.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's really inspiring to see and to read her thoughts and her understandings of the teachings that she's being given. Um, Also from the chat, we're so struck by your description of how all is relational. So sort of, I guess, piggybacking off of your previous answer, how do you straddle Indigenous views with settler laws?
Ooh, this is this is the bulk of my academic work, is really trying to understand and highlight these differences and make space for Indigenous laws to be part of decision making, especially in environmental contexts, and relating to water and treaties as well. Um, I think, one of the things that I want to point out is the fundamental difference in how we understand law from different perspectives. And from, a Western perspective, law is completely built around individuals and protecting private interests. And a lot of it is centered around conflict, right? Adversarial processes, and people having obligations, and then rights. And then, it's a lot about breaking those relationships. Whereas if you think about Anishinaabe law and its intent, and its structure, it is relational. You're taking into account all of those relationships all the time and weighing how your relationship with one being has an impact on others and vice versa. And it becomes this complex web of interconnected relationships that are all striving towards the same thing, which is Minobimatsuin, or a collective sense of well-being, and trying to maintain not only yourself in that wellness, but everyone, and all things around you. And one of the moments that I thought was very interesting and humbling is asking some elders, like, how would you, if you add the prefix ni, it means mine. So would you add that to Minobimatsuin, Minobimatsuin? And they said to me, that doesn't exist. That concept of your own, only yourself well-being, it doesn't exist, because your well-being is dependent on the well-being of others that are in relationship with you. And that was another very profound moment that it doesn't make its way into this book, but I think it might in the next, is trying to understand, that idea of relationality as being interconnected through the concepts of wellness and collective wellness. And I think that, this book starts to hint at it, but there's a lot more to unpack there. So if you contrast these laws, so the systems that help us make good decisions, one is centered on individuals and protection of private property for the most part, and grounded in conflict. The other is relationships and collective well-being. And we can see that they're completely different ways of seeing the world, completely different ways of making decisions. And, if you think about how treaties were made and their intent, the Anishinaabe parties or Indigenous nations that helped make treaties were really bringing this framework and this thought to the negotiation and saying, we'll agree to work together, we'll be in relationship, and it will be for our collective well-being. So if we think about that, along with concepts like respect and renewal and reciprocity, as part of the treaty relationship, then we have a very, very different understanding than what's written and what becomes land transactions and contracts. And that's when we really start getting into the spirit and intent of treaties.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a very fulsome and a huge topic to get into. And I think, you know, especially heading into spring, it's a time of renewal. I think this is a really fantastic book for people to read, to rethink their relationship with nature and the meaning of treaties and how they're acting in their relationships with everybody and everything around them. So thank you for that. Do we have any more questions in the chat here today? Or if anyone would like to be unmuted, we definitely encourage that. We've got another question here. If a child or family is inspired to become more active in living well together or sharing the land, could you offer suggestions?
Yeah, well, building relationships is number one and contributing. So, you know, not wanting to have relationships where you take, but rather where there's that reciprocity that's engaged, and educating ourselves and each other, I think, is really important. Supporting. And then there are some very practical things that we can do. So learn, you know, the treaty of your area. Who are the people? What are the traditional names of the territory on which you are residing? Make inquiries about what kind of contributions those nations are asking for you to make into the treaty relationship. And so it's not going to be the same everywhere across Canada. That's going to be regional and specific and relational. Right now, I'm working on a project with the David Suzuki Foundation where we're exploring the concept of land back. So returning lands and territories, I think, is another important part of the conversation. And so there's a lot of different ways where we can really engage with these different approaches to living well together. And I think the first step is, you know, that gaining that knowledge and building relationships. That's what's going to make change.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time with us today, and your wisdom and your beautiful words. It's been really inspiring. And like I said, spring is here. The sun is shining. I can't wait to go outside and to share your book with everybody that I cross paths with. If there are any more questions from the chat, I think we're heading to our time here. So I just wanted to say thank you again to Aimée, and thank you to everybody for your questions today and for joining us. And please pick up treaty words wherever it's available for you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Miigwech.
Miigwech.